Great, we're going to get started. So welcome to Scholastic Parent Briefings. These are 30-minute quick run round a topic. And we talk for about 20 minutes as a panel and then open it up to the floor for questions. And we're going to today be talking in this session about single-sex schools, and the title says why are they back in vogue, and that's something perhaps we'll make that a question. Perhaps are they back in vogue? I have no idea. But I've got a fantastic pair of heads from two very eminent single-sex schools. Jardine-Young, who's principal of Cheltenham Ladies College, which some of you might have heard of, and Dominic Luckett, who's headmaster of Sherborne School, which again I think is extremely well-known school. So we've got a really fantastic panel to talk about this. And I thought maybe just to kick this thing off, we would start with our two heads and ask them about their own schooling and whether they went to co-ed or single-sex schools themselves.
Hi everyone, thank you very much for being here. So my schooling, I was in co-ed school, day school, for most of my life. I was born and raised in Malawi in Central Africa, where my parents lived for 30 years. And then I went to a girls' school for my sixth form, which was actually the same school that I'm now the head of, in a bizarre elliptical irony. I'm sure at that moment in time I had no plan whatsoever to do this. But so I had the experience of both co-ed and all girls during my secondary school education.
And what about you, Dominic?
I went to a all-boys state school in Norfolk, so not the sort of school I now work in. So I had no experience whatsoever of girls until I was 18, and that affected my university years in all sorts of ways that I probably won't go into now.
Okay, well, we will return to that topic. That is one of the questions, I think. But what about your teaching experience, both of you? Were always in single sex, or have you flitted about?
Flitted about. I started off in boys only, teaching at Radley College. Then I was at Epsom College for 10 years, which was co-ed, but only girls in the sixth form at that time. It is now mixed throughout. But during my decade of teaching at Epsom, they went co-ed from 13. So I had that opportunity of witnessing a school that was sort of co-educationalising, if you like, from the juniors up. And then I've been the head of Cheltenham Ladies College now for 12 years.
Not dissimilar to Eve, I started teaching at Harrow, so obviously all boys, did 11 years there. Went to Worth as deputy head when that was an all-boys school, but just as I left, it went co-ed. Then I went to Mill Hill as head, did 9 years there, and that was a co-ed school. And for the last 7 years, I've been at Sherborne, which is all boys.
Okay, so let's turn it away from the panel and to the audience. Who went to a single-sex school as a child? Put your hand up, please. And who went to a co-ed school as a child? Okay, so interestingly, more parents went to a co-ed school as children than single-sex. That's surprised me, actually. And who wants single-sex for their child currently as their sort of top choice? Ooh, 1, 2, 3. 4, maybe. Okay, so we've got to make a case here, guys. You've not got an audience that kind of either went to it or wants it. So that's really interesting. All right, so let's start then with the kind of background to this thing. Britain's got a mix of single-sex and co-ed schools, but at one point they were all single-sex. And at some point during the 20th century, many schools either founded themselves as co-ed schools or went co-ed, and some didn't. Why did your schools not?
I probably would hesitate to speak with absolute certainty as to the causality of the decisions made by my predecessors, but I suspect in our specific case, the fact that the school's name is Cheltenham Ladies College, and there is also a Cheltenham College already, within half a mile, may have played its part in the passion for remaining girls only. That's the short answer, Guy.
Yeah, well, that's interesting. My daughter's at Camden School for Girls, and they have boys.
So it's clearly not impossible.
We're single-sex for a very similar reason to you, actually. We're the boys' school in Sherborne, but there's also Sherburn Girls, right next door, which is just girls. So we've never really seen the need to go co-ed because the boys can do lots of things with the girls. But also there would be a civil war in the town were we to start admitting girls. And Ruth Sullivan, who's the head over there, is quite scary, and I don't really want to have to go to war with her. So that's why we are single sex.
Yeah, so proximity to the opposite sex seems to be one of the defining factors why you can stay as a single-sex school. That's quite interesting, isn't it? We're not talking necessarily about a monastic form of education, though we'll come back to that as a question. So let's start with the basic case for it then. You've got an audience that is slightly disbelieving. What's the 21st century case for a single-sex education? Not the 17th century.
I hope Eve will agree with me. Single sex in isolation, particularly for boys, is a terrible thing. I've worked in schools where the boys get to see no girls at all throughout the term, and other than for a social on a Saturday night. That is not a good way for boys to learn to form meaningful, productive, respectful relationships with girls. So single sex works for us at Sherburn, as I suspect, Eve, it works for you in Cheltenham, because they do have that interaction with girls. So I think if you take boys for 5 years of their lives and you put them in, as you say, a monastic environment, it's not great. So that's why it works for us. I'm not sure it's necessarily a good thing in other contexts.
Okay. Shut me down if I'm still talking in about 2 minutes, Guy, because you told me to be snappy and short, so I'm going to try. I think it's a really good question, and may I just say thank you to those of you who are here who are not convinced by the concept of single-sex education to spend a little bit of time thinking about it. It's really appreciated. I think from the fact you've heard of our experience, we've both really loved the schools that we have either led or we've worked in. And what I would say about our country as a whole is it is really, really wonderful to have a choice. It's really wonderful that you as parents even can make this decision and think about what feels right for your children. So, we have a family, actually, rather uniquely, who have 12 children, 7 daughters and 5 sons. And they are very, very clear in their minds as parents that the boys go to boys' schools and the girls go to the girls' schools, and they will not hear anything other than this. And that works for them. There's another family who have 1 single daughter. Now, the reality of those children's home life, bearing in mind you're only actually at school for under 40 weeks a year. So you are with your family, you are with your other friends, you are with the rest of your life for the rest of the time that you are alive and growing up as a young person. So actually thinking about a school choice in isolation from your own family experiences, I think could be unwise and lead to an imbalanced view of sort of blunt instrument generalizations. So if you're, as we do, have girls who have growing up with siblings, with boys, perhaps other sisters or cousins, or that they've been in a very fabulous co-ed prep school, the girls themselves will say to their parents, I don't need to be around boys for the next 5 years to understand the male psychology. I'm living with them at home and their friends are always coming around, or I don't need that. I don't need it for that reason. Might need it for another reason, but that should not be the reason. So I would say each family should feel totally confident about making a decision that feels absolutely right for you, and don't write off a single-sex school till you've actually been to see some of them, one of them at least, because modern 21st century schools, boarding and day, I think the kids are so connected to each other through social media and other ways that it is very difficult to grow up in a single-sex mindset, even if you are in a single-sex school now. I'm rambling too much.
No, you're not rambling. I was thinking actually that both of you are making a weaker case than I would make on it. And my daughter's at Camden School for Girls. It's only co-ed in the sixth form. It's a girls' school, the bit she's in. And we chose it for her very specifically because it was a girls' school. And I think there are very particular things that single-sex schools can offer, particularly in the kind of teens, that are different from co-ed schools. Girls and boys don't mature at the same age, and they do have quite different experiences of the world. Our daughter found making female friendships quite difficult, and actually she needed to be with lots of girls to get that sorted. And it really has. The school's been amazing for that, absolutely amazing. So I think we're making rather a weak case at the moment. We need to toughen it up. So one of
can
the
we go
obvious
off the
things
leash a bit then?
Yeah. So one of the things that's often said about girls in girls' schools is that they take on roles that boys would do in co-ed schools.
Yeah. So we have 18 different sports, always for girls. Football, girls cricket, coached by a professional. They take all the parts in the plays. They lead everything. I don't think it occurs to them that they can't do stuff. That it just doesn't enter their minds. We have strong representation in STEM, science, engineering, MIT, Imperial, etc., etc. I think it's almost so normal in that environment that it doesn't occur to them that this might not be the case everywhere. So, Guy, thank you for urging us to make that case a bit more powerfully. I think the danger that I feel, having worked in some wonderful co-ed schools as well, is to come across as rather shrill and defensive. And that is not the atmosphere in our schools. It isn't shrill, and it isn't defensive, and it isn't closed-minded. It's actually very, very open-minded and very open to the world. So I was listening to an Icelandic nursery school teacher, not speaking in Icelandic. Her English was magnificent, thank goodness. But in Iceland, they actually separate boys from girls educationally at the age of 2. And we were slightly sort of, startled by this revelation. And they said what is fascinating is even as young as 2, when the boys are not there, the girls go into the whole behavioural range that is often occupied, at least to some extent, by the boys. And the boys go into the whole behavioural range. So they see more tenderness, more kindness, more gentleness from boys than they might otherwise have seen in a co-ed equivalent space.
I mean, that's incredibly interesting. And there was, girls' schools were founded because girls weren't allowed into boys' schools. I mean, it was as simple as that. And there was a political side to that foundation that has stayed there in girls' schools all the way through. Boys' schools were accidentally single-sex, I think. They just were. It was the dominant group, and they didn't feel they had to make a case for it. But now they do. So what's the equivalent case for boys for single-sex, Dominic?
I think that historical thing is interesting, Guy, in that if you look at Sherborne, my school was founded originally in 705. Sherborne Girls was founded in 1899, so it took just over 1,000 years for them to get round to founding the other school. I think there are a number of things that are interesting. First, the number of people who are here who are not thinking, single sex is the thing. And I think it's great that you've come and you're, in that sense, I suppose, open-minded. And I like to think that reflects the fact that we are single sex is a characteristic of our schools, but it's not necessarily the defining characteristic. Both of us have worked in single sex schools, in co-ed schools. There are brilliant single sex schools out there, and there are less good single sex. And equally, some of the co-ed schools are outstanding. I think the point that Eve made is about, I suppose, the lack of gendering. In our school, I think, first of all, the boys, as with yours, they do so many things. Music and sport are really strong, but you don't, as I've seen in co-ed schools, have boys who think, well, I'm in the first 15, I'm not exactly going to sing in the choir, am I? They're not living up to or conforming to or weighed down by stereotypes. They just do stuff because they want to do it. And I think that's quite liberating for boys. The thing about kindness, I think is a really important thing. Our boys tend to be, very, very kind. They look out for other people. They are engaging, and in a way that perhaps wasn't my experience when I was running a co-ed school. But I think there is a strong, particularly for boys, really strong academic argument for single sex. When I was at school, I didn't work that hard, but I think I'd have worked much less hard had there been girls in the classroom that I could have tried to impress. Because I was denied that, I had nothing better to do in the class than actually work. Our boys do really well academically, particularly in terms of value added, the academic progress they make. And I think that's because they're not distracted. They're not distracted in classes. They're not there to distract girls. And again, with the subjects, there's no sort of gendering of the subjects. Boys just do the subjects they want to do, rather than thinking there are certain subjects that are for boys and certain subjects that are for girls. So, Guy, I'm sorry that we're making this weak case for single sex.
No, you're strengthening it as you speak. It's very good.
Are we getting better?
You are getting better. But going back onto the mixing thing, I've heard an awful lot before, I think we should share it again, about the tea shops of Sherburn. So just tell us a bit about how boys and girls meet.
They meet in all sorts of ways. Quite a few boys at my school have siblings at Ruth's school, at Sherburn Girls, and that's a really great point of contact. And if you're a boy at my school who has a sister at Sherburn Girls, you are that much more popular than you would otherwise be, which is great. And the boys get to know girls as friends. And this is something, again, in my youth, I used to think that if you had a friend who was a girl, that was your girlfriend. I honestly didn't realise until I went to university, and even then it took me quite some time to realise, that you could just have nice, healthy, normal friendships with girls, and there was nothing beyond a friendship. I didn't realise that existed because my horizons had been so limited. And I think the friendship thing is really important. But it's also, it shouldn't just be about boys and girls meeting to go for a cup of coffee in Costa on the high street in Sherburn, or having a social on a Saturday night, and they have lots of those. It should be about them working together productively, collaboratively, doing things like discussing things in our amnesty group, or doing sailing, or CCF, or being in the orchestra together, or the choir, or all these things that we do jointly. And one of the great things is it, first of all, teaches boys how to work productively, collaboratively, and on an equal footing with girls. But it also teaches them a bit of humility, because it's quite interesting. We've recently sort of opened up the CCF, the cadet force, to girls from Sherburn Girls. And we have 3 sections. We have Army, Navy, and Royal Marines. And it just so happens, on merit, the 3 cadets who are head of each of those sections are all girls from Sherburn Girls. And that's brilliant for the boys, because they realise that girls are really good at stuff. And that's what they need to know going out into the world. So mixing is important, but not just social mixing.
I'm going to throw a question back at the audience now. Who lives in London? Okay, pretty high number. Well, in London, a lot of schools are single sex. I mean, like a really high proportion of independent schools and quite a lot of state schools. So even though the audience started off saying, well, we're not that interested in single sex, you kind of have to be interested a bit because you live in London. I mean, you may not want it, but it's there because that's the condition that we all exist in London. So one of the interesting things with the school show is you get to really have a choice, because there are an enormous range of schools from all over the UK, some single sex, some co-ed. Just to return back to the topic of your university experiences, it used to be argued that single-sex schooling had a long-term impact on adult relationships. What do you think about that, Eve?
So, Guy, I think life after COVID, which is, well, we're not after COVID yet, are we? We're kind of tentatively emerging nervously into a living alongside COVID period. But we found ourselves running schools that were still schools when the schools were shut. And it has been the most extraordinary 3 years, I would say, and it will continue to be extraordinary for at least, I'm sure, another 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years. We've got generations of young people who are coming through our schools now who have had a completely isolated experience of being educated because of this enforced home lockdown, homeschooling. I'm sure you're having some flashbacks of what you all went through in those times. And what we're seeing actually coming out of this is a different way of engaging with each other socially and delabeling. So I would say what we feel in our school currently is diversity is really important. And it's less about a gender lens, or let's say a heteronormative lens of boys and girls who might be attracted to each other. You talk to anybody under 25, they're rolling their eyes slightly thinking this is a bit 1980s thinking, isn't it, really? That's not how they are seeing the world, and that's not how they're seeing each other and society.
No, I get this. This is my daughter's world completely.
There we go. Guy, absolutely.
She loves that about school.
Yeah.
She really does.
Exactly. So I think we've got to be very careful not to put our baggage in front of them on their path. They've got their own issues, which they will tell us about. But I think the socio-economic diversity is quite important in a school. Ethnic and cultural mix is quite important in a school. How your son or your daughter grows up and how they see themselves, how they have self-esteem or not, what they understand me versus other, who is the other, who is we, who is I, will be shaped by who they mix with, who they encounter, the positivity and the inclusivity of those experiences, actually. So what we have taken an approach in the last 3, 4, 5 years of actually reaching out into Cheltenham more as a town and less where are the boys and more where are the people? You know, how can we develop? And this has been a great joy, actually, the Cheltenham Education Partnership, which now has 11 secondary schools, GCHQ, the Cheltenham Festivals, the Arts Festival, the Christian Arts Festival, faith groups, and it has become a wonderfully rich and inclusive experience. And I think the pupils themselves are less interested in finding their way to the opposite gender and just interested in meeting people that they don't normally meet. And that open-mindedness is actually really, really healthy, I think. So
before the talk started, I'm sorry, it sounds like I'm not listening, but I am listening. It follows on completely for what you're saying. So before the talk started, we were talking a bit about ISI inspections and about safeguarding and how they inspect safeguarding. And at the Hurlingham show, I asked a couple of boarding heads a really quite difficult question, which is how do you tell, as a parent looking at a school, whether the safeguarding is any good or not? And it's, I think, a really hard thing to judge as an external as a parent. Because all schools will say they've got the systems in place and blah, blah, blah. We know some haven't. But I've got quite an interesting rule of thumb, which I think probably would apply to your school, which I think if you asked what they do about LGBT, for example, that a school that's good at that will probably be quite good at safeguarding. What do you reckon? Yeah, absolutely. And I think what's changed, what I've seen change in the last 3, 4 years particularly, is the emergence really of allyship. So people who might have thought, well, that's a club for this kind of person or this kind of theme, but that's not me, so I'm not going to be interested in that. It's more now, well, one of these days that might be my brother, my sister, my roommate, my work colleague. And I'd say that applies to deepening, they have more curiosity about understanding autism, understanding people who think in a different way, who see the world in a different way. And if those people are in a group where their rights or their opportunities are asymmetrically evident, they are much more interested in actually standing alongside them, even though that's not me today, but actually championing those rights and coming from a place which is less about tick box and virtue signalling and more about coming
from a deeper place of complex understanding.
This generation, I think, is much nicer than we were. I think that's a really quite a key
That's a
thing.
wonderful summary. There's hope for the future, guys, isn't there, with this lot coming through. They are absolutely wonderful. They're a joy.
Dominic, you talk about your experiences at school and then having them challenged at university. Are there children, families for whom single-sex schooling isn't the right choice?
That's a really good question. I'm not sure there are. I think there are schools which are not right for particular children, and it may be that some of those for a particular child are single-sex, some are co-ed, because I think everything we've been saying today is that you can't separate out one characteristic of a school and see that as the defining characteristic. And going back to Eve's point, our mission is to help the children go out into the world, be comfortable in the world, to be able to function and succeed and thrive in the world, and to be nice to other people. And one of the things I think that you were saying, Eve, that's so important is the recognition that not everybody's like me. Everybody's different. And, you know, it's not about tolerance. It's not about saying, you know, do I tolerate difference? It's about celebrating difference, or actually just thinking, well, you know, difference is just something that is part of the warp and weft of life, and it should be unremarkable in that sense. But honestly, I struggle to see in my mind a child who you'd say you can't put them in a single-sex school. So, no.
Thank you.
Everybody should go to single-sex schools.
Okay, so we've got literally about 1 minute. So I'm going to say, does anyone have a burning question? Okay, there's a burning question there. Where's Ellen with the microphone coming over?
Thank you. My name's Holly. I used to be a journalist. I always have burning questions. My question for you, and this is something that I get asked about by a lot of schools actually, is how do you create a sort of inclusive environment for young people who might be questioning their gender assignment, who might be trans or non-binary, for example? I'm really curious.
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, I'd say in recent years, you know, this is certainly a topic that we've been reflecting on at length. I no longer go on to stage an assembly and say, morning, ladies, morning, girls, like something out of, you know, St. Trinian's. I will say, hello, everyone. So, but there's a fine balance when you have the name of your school has a genderized word in it, between creating an internal, almost the meta language of your organization internally that becomes so neutralized away from genderized words that you create this disconnect with the name of your own school. So, you know, in the world at large, everybody is trying to find their way over this difficult country landscape at the moment. And there are some very, very strong views, aren't there, amongst young people and amongst various groups of all ages, I would imagine. But we would see this as an extension of things like nationalities and cultural identities and rights. It's about being prepared to have difficult, awkward conversations together to deepen your understanding of what actually is offensive or not offensive, what's correct, what's appropriate, what's overcompensating, what's too much, what's too little. All of the understanding, I think, is built through the dialogue in the middle ground, as opposed to, here's the policy and we're all now going to say these words. So it's fabulous territory for the pupils to actually take a lead. They don't always agree with each other, and I have got a good legal advisor who sets out a nice, clear framework about what rights everybody has. And they're not always where people think they are, interestingly.
Can I just add very quickly to that? I think the whole thing is about accustoming children to difference, and not sort of binary or black and white differences, but just people just fundamentally are different. And I remember when I was at school, and actually up until quite recently, I used to pretend I was interested in sport, because that's what everybody else did. And I thought, I can't say actually, it doesn't interest me because I didn't want to be seen as different. Getting children to realise that it's okay to be different and that people around them fundamentally are different. It doesn't matter so much what the issue. I mean, some issues are more complicated, technical, nuanced than others. But the acceptance of difference, both as it pertains to yourself and as it relates to those around you, I think that's the fundamental thing. And then that covers a whole range of issues and actually the whole sort of gamut of human experience and existence.
I really want to thank Dominic and Eve. It was quite an inspiring session. So just a final thing before we stand up. Who would now consider a single-sex school? Hello. Okay, well done. We've changed minds
Thank
here.
you.
Great.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. And they will, of course, be available for long, extended conversations all over the place.
Thank you very much.